It's an incredibly haunting visual, isn't it?
It really is. Welcome to the debate. Today, we are dissecting a pretty terrifying modern phenomenon. Psychologists and clinicians are increasingly looking at the classic folklore of the haunted house, not just as a ghost story, but as a clinical framework to understand the major loneliness epidemic.
Right, the idea of the tragic spirit. Exactly. A spirit trapped in a house, unseen by the living. They're using this as a dark metaphor for the profound alienation of the modern provider. And we are examining a really intense tension here. The central disagreement we have to explore is this. Does this phenomenon of men in their 40s and 50s sitting silently in their living rooms represent a tragic, soul-crushing horror of unmet emotional needs? Or is it, well, the noble, expected, and inherently silent duty of traditional provision?
That is the core of it.
Yeah. So, I will be arguing that being a provider is a silent foundational duty where feeling quote-unquote ignored is simply a modern entitlement. Meanwhile, my colleague argues that reducing a human being to an invisible utility is a cruel, soul-destroying lie that results in extreme psychological starvation.
And that truly is the dividing line we need to explore today. Because, we really have to ask ourselves what we are actually demanding of men when we accept this paradigm of silent suffering.
Well, suffering is a strong word for duty, but go on.
It is, but I use it intentionally. The traditionalist view, the one you're outlining, it operates on a premise that just collapses when we look at the clinical outcomes. We are looking at millions of men who are, for all psychological intents and purposes, dead inside. They are haunting the very houses they built like ghosts, reduced to what clinicians are directly calling a mere utility, an invisible ATM.
An invisible ATM. Wow.
Yeah, an invisible ATM. And that isn't nobility, right? That is erasure. We are talking about extreme psychological starvation happening in plain sight. Men dying of loneliness in a house full of people simply because their emotional needs are systematically ignored.
I see why you frame it as erasure. It sounds deeply tragic when you put it that way. But let's pause and think about what a provider is fundamentally supposed to do. The alienation you're describing is, in my view, a misinterpretation of stoic duty.
A misinterpretation? How so?
Well, a strong man doesn't need a parade when he walks through the door. Think about the analogy of the house itself. The man is the foundation of the home. And what is the defining characteristic of a foundation? It is meant to be unseen.
Right, but a foundation is made of concrete. It is completely inanimate.
Exactly. It's buried in the earth, right? Bearing the weight of the structure so that everything above it can flourish safely. The fact that the rest of the family can talk, connect, and thrive in the living room, the very room he worked endlessly to pay for, is proof of this ultimate success, not a tragedy. Feeling ignored in that scenario is, frankly, a modern entitlement.
I have to push back hard on that. Human beings aren't concrete. We cannot survive as pure foundations. Let's look at the folklore metaphor the source material uses, because it's brilliant. A poltergeist doesn't stay quiet in the walls.
No, it makes a lot of noise.
Exactly. It throws plates, it slams doors, it knocks on the walls. Why? Just to prove it still exists. When humans are unseen by the living, when they're trapped and unable to move on, they experience profound psychological horror. They are trapped. You can't just slap the word duty on extreme isolation and call it a success.
Okay, but wait. Let me challenge that directly. If the family is safe, housed, and happily connecting in the living room, why do psychologists insist on pathologizing the man's quiet observation as a loneliness epidemic?
Because he's not connecting with them.
But shouldn't the joy of the family be enough to sustain him? If his goal was to provide a safe haven, and they are enjoying that haven, why must we assume he is miserable just because he's quiet?
Because the data tells us he is miserable. We see massive spikes in middle-aged male despair and clinical depression. This assumes he's benevolently watching from a place of fulfilled satisfaction. But he isn't. He is experiencing the terrifying reality of being physically present but emotionally dead.
I struggle with this framing of the family's view of him. You brought up the phrase invisible ATM earlier.
Yeah, it's a very common clinical description.
Right. But it implies this deeply cynical, transactional coldness, like they're just using him. Let me offer a different analogy here. Think about the water pipes and the electrical grid in a home.
Okay, where are you going with this?
They are utilities, right? We never think about them. We never thank the plumbing. We only notice them when they break or when the power goes out. But without them, the house is uninhabitable.
Sure.
So their invisibility is the ultimate proof of their perfection. Isn't being a reliable utility the highest form of love a provider can offer? Providing financial stability, paying the mortgage, is a concrete demonstration of love.
If you are equating a human being's highest form of love to the function of municipal plumbing, that is exactly the soul-destroying lie I am talking about.
It's not soul-destroying, it's sacrifice. The demand for constant emotional validation undermines that sacrifice.
No, let's maintain some definitional precision here. A utility, a water pipe, an electrical grid, an ATM, does not have emotional needs. It doesn't have a nervous system. A human being does. When these men, adult men in their 40s and 50s, are completely unseen and unheard, they experience agonizing isolation.
But if he expects them to validate him constantly, isn't that making his love transactional?
It's not a transaction to want your family to know who you are. Reducing a human being to an ATM destroys their soul. You're saying he's a utility. Utilities don't require empathy or intimacy, but when those basic emotional needs are ignored in a human, the man essentially fades away.
I hear you, but I think the horror of this is vastly exaggerated. We're acting like this is some new apocalyptic psychological crisis. Men have been providing silently for generations without claiming to be, screaming in absolute silence.
Did they not claim it, or did nobody ask them?
I mean, they found purpose in the duty itself. They didn't view themselves as victims of a horror story. I would argue that the true monster here isn't the traditional dynamic.
Then what is the monster?
The monster is the modern obsession with constant emotional fulfillment over duty and resilience. We're telling men that if they aren't the center of an emotional parade every night, they're being abused by their families.
No one is asking for a parade. We are asking for basic human visibility. And this brings us to the actual climax of the psychological horror here, drawing directly on what the source material describes.
Which is?
The terrifying realization of the living ghost. Because the scariest monster isn't hiding under the bed or in the closet. The true psychological horror is the slow, agonizing realization of looking in the mirror and realizing you have faded entirely out of your own life.
Faded out of your own life. That's a heavy concept.
It's heartbreaking. You look in the mirror and you realize you are haunting your own living room. You are screaming in absolute silence, while everyone around you simply looks right through you. They see the house, they see the food, but they do not see you.
Because you made yourself the foundation so they could thrive.
Yes, but at the cost of your own humanity. No human being can survive being reduced to an invisible utility. The psychological starvation of the living ghost is a devastating modern crisis, and we cannot romanticize it as noble duty anymore.
Well, as we wrap up here, I'll summarize my position by reiterating that there is a quiet dignity and immense strength in being the unseen foundation of a family. Providing for loved ones, even when unacknowledged, is a noble sacrifice. I don't believe it should be cast as a horror story just because it lacks modern emotional validation.
And my position remains that the male loneliness epidemic is a chilling reality. The psychological starvation of these men is profound. Reducing someone to an ATM is a devastating crisis that destroys the soul.
There is clearly a deep tension here between the nobility of sacrifice and the vital human need to be seen and emotionally nourished. And listeners, we suggest you explore this delicate balance in your own lives. There's so much more to unpack in this material, and we have to leave it there for today.
Look around your living room. Make a sound. Break something if you have to, before you fade away completely and they forget you were ever there.